Hello YouTube. In this video I'm going to talk about veganism, and I'm going to examine one of the central challenges to the view, the causal impotence problem, or more generally the problem of bridging the gap between production and consumption. So I'm going to talk about meat for the purposes of simplicity, but of course the points here are going to apply to other animal products. And we're just going to assume, for the sake of argument, that the production of meat is morally wrong. There are many different reasons why it might be wrong, but again, just for the purposes of simplicity, let's say it's morally wrong to kill animals or to cause animals to suffer merely to produce food, given that we have other ways of producing food. So let's take all of that for granted. So now consider a carnivore who says something like this. Well, yes, it's wrong to kill animals for food, but look, I've never killed an animal. When I buy a chicken from a supermarket, the chicken is already dead. Moreover, the mere act of purchasing a chicken from a supermarket doesn't in itself kill any other chickens. So I'm not doing anything morally wrong by purchasing the chicken. Yeah, this meat production, that's appalling, that's terrible, but there is a gap between meat production and meat consumption. The arguments against meat production don't in themselves do anything to condemn meat consumption, or in general purchasing meat. So an important question for veganism is how to bridge this gap. Now there's a standard kind of response to this, which is a causal response. So the vegans can say, look, what matters is not whether you personally kill any animals. What matters is whether you act in ways that make a difference to the number of animals killed. It's wrong to behave in ways that can reasonably be expected to cause more killing. So, by analogy, suppose that I pay somebody to shoot a dog. Well, it would be no defense of myself to say, look, of course I agree that it's wrong to shoot dogs, but all I did was give money to another person. I didn't shoot the dog myself. The reason why that's no defense is because by paying for the dog to be shot, you are responsible for the dog's death, at least partially. Along the same lines, when I purchase a chicken, I create a demand for chicken. I'm essentially saying to the meat industry, yes, kill more chickens for me. And so this demand for more chicken, this causes meat producers to increase supply by killing more chickens. I'm like I said, I'm basically paying the meat industry to kill chickens for me. So you can argue something like this. You can say, first, purchasing meat causes increased production of meat. Second, production of meat is wrong. Third, it's wrong to do something that causes wrongdoing. If X causes Y and Y is wrong, then X is wrong. So it's wrong to purchase meat. Obviously, this third premise, I mean, there may be exceptions to this, but something along these lines seems to be sort of right? Like typically it's going to be wrong to do things that cause wrongdoing. So this is the causal sort of argument. The most popular objection to this argument is the causal impotence objection. So, in the dog case, assigning responsibility is pretty straightforward, right? The dog would not have been killed had I not paid the killer. My paying the killer makes the killer shoot the dog. But the causal impotence objection goes, the meat industry will rear and kill basically the same amount of animals regardless of what I choose to purchase. The causal argument assumes a perfectly efficient market, where each time you purchase a chicken, you slightly increase the demand for chicken. This slight increase in demand causes a slight increase in the market price of chicken, and the slight increase in market price causes a slight increase of supply, so that means more killing of chickens. But the problem is that the actual meat industry is not a perfectly efficient market. The food system is enormous. Income is provided not just by consumers, but also by subsidies. Supply chains are extremely complex, interconnected with other social systems in complex ways, and there's a great deal of waste at every point in every chain. So, for instance, the meat that goes out of date on the supermarket shelves. So when you decide not to buy a chicken, the chicken that you choose not to buy perhaps just becomes waste. But that's just an ever so slight increase in waste in a system where the amount of waste is always fluctuating anyway. So the industry is not likely to be responsive to that. In all likelihood, the signal that's generated by your decision to purchase meat or to refrain from purchasing meat is just going to be lost as we go up the chain from retailer to distributor to wholesaler to slaughterhouse to producer. Moreover, even if we suppose that the market was sensitive to the tiny increase in demand when you give up chicken, so I mean that would mean a very slight decrease in the expected price that chicken will fetch. Even if you assume that, it doesn't. Arguably, it's not likely that this would actually affect the number of chickens killed, because farmers decide how many chickens to breed, not just on the basis of the expected price that their chickens will fetch when sold, but based on how many chickens their farm can support and the expected price of chicken feed and other materials required to rear the chickens. Fluctuations in the price of chicken feed will have a far more significant effect. You know, the reduction in demand from one consumer on the far end of the supply chain is barely even noise. Profits are expected to fluctuate year on year anyway. I mean, orders from retailers will fluctuate year on year. You can always switch to a different retailer if one retailer orders less than usual. If the demand slightly reduces, you can slightly reduce price to compensate. I mean, the point is that the tendency is to just raise the maximum number of chickens that you can afford within your budget. And then variations in market conditions create some uncertainty about exactly how much profit will be made. But that's it. I mean, you know, that uncertainty is there anyway. So a single person choosing to purchase or choosing to refrain from purchasing chicken doesn't, in ordinary circumstances, make any difference to the number of animals killed. Of course, this is the case when we're talking about the industrial food system, you know, where we're talking about this kind of like mass agriculture. It's not true for the small family farms where, you know, they're much smaller operations and much more sensitive to small variations in demand. So, you know, this argument may, you know, the causal argument may mean that we should cease purchasing meat from these sources. But the causal impotence objection will say, look, when it comes to, you know, when it comes to the sort of ordinary case of chicken in a supermarket, it's just not going to make any difference. Now, this is, of course, an objection that arises in the context of many collective action problems. So take voting. Even if there is a significant difference between the platforms of the political parties, my vote is vanishingly unlikely to make any difference. There are millions of other voters, and the election will be decided. It won't be decided on the basis of just one vote, or at least it's very, very unlikely to be decided on the basis of just one vote. So I might as well just stay home. And there are many people who will argue that they're under no obligation to vote for precisely this reason. So, you know, I mean, if you find that argument against voting persuasive, you will probably also find that you're, you know, not quite so persuaded that, you know, there's any reason for you to give up chicken. In fact, notice that, if anything, the causal impotence problem might be more pressing for the vegan than it is for the voter, because with voting, I mean, if you live in a society that has robust democratic institutions, you can at least be confident that your vote will be counted. I mean, even if your signal is unlikely to make any difference, it will appear in the final tally of the election. But part of the causal impotence objection to veganism is that that's just not true for the choice that you make about whether to purchase meat. The market doesn't even keep a tally of your signal. As you go further up the chain, it's just lost. So this is the problem. So, standard response to the problem is the threshold response. A number of philosophers have given the threshold response. So one example is Alistair Norcross in his article Puppies, Pigs and People. So Norcross argues that even if the market does not typically respond to the changes in the behaviour of one person, well, clearly the market must respond to changes in the behaviour of very large numbers of people. I mean, after all, if everybody stopped eating chicken, we would no longer breed chickens. If 50% of people who eat chicken stopped eating chicken, we would breed far fewer chickens. So obviously, I mean, we don't know exactly what these numbers are, but let's say, for the sake of argument, that the market is sensitive to a reduction in demand that's the equivalent of 10,000 people giving up chicken. So for each 10,000 people who give up chicken, several 100,000 fewer chickens will be bred and killed each year. Now, if you give up chicken, you're going to be one of these 10,000 people, in which case you have a 1 in 10,000 chance of making a difference to the number of chickens bred and killed. You have a 1 in 10,000 chance of making it so that several 100,000 fewer chickens are killed each year, because you have a 1 in 10,000 chance of being that person who's on that threshold. So if you're saying, look, market's equivalent to a reduction in demand, the equivalent of market sensitive to a reduction in demand, the equivalent of 10,000 people, then 10,000 is the threshold, and you've got a 1 in 10,000 chance of being the person on that threshold. Now, a 1 in 10,000 chance is very small, but if you pass that threshold, the difference you're making is extremely great, because if you pass that threshold, if you make it so that we pass the threshold and thousands of fewer chickens are being killed, then you're responsible for saving thousands of lives, or at least preventing thousands of deaths or whatever. I guess you're not saving lives, because I guess the chickens wouldn't be bred in the first place, but you get the point. You're responsible for a significant reduction in animal suffering. So by choosing to continue purchasing chicken, you're going to risk a pretty enormous harm. You're risking the harm of thousands of chickens being bred and killed each year than would otherwise be the case. And that's a very small risk. You're taking a small risk of creating great harm, but taking a small risk of creating a great harm is still morally wrong. It's wrong to take even small risks of doing things that have great harms. Now, again, we've made these numbers up for the sake of argument, but regardless of what the actual numbers are, the basic principle holds. When you purchase chicken, there's a small risk of doing an extremely great harm. And that's wrong. The basic principle here is actions that even slightly raise the probability of great harms are morally wrong. Indeed, I suppose if we think of this in terms of standard ways of modelling expected utility, then we would say that a 1 in 10,000 chance of causing 10,000 chickens to be killed is equivalent to a 1 in 1 chance of causing 1 chicken to be killed. A small risk of a very great harm should, depending on how you weigh the harm and the risk, that should sometimes be treated as the same as a certain chance of causing a much smaller harm. Again, making up these numbers, but the point is that buying chicken with its small chance of making a massive difference is maybe not so different morally from just killing 1 chicken yourself. We can also add, look, it's, you can't ignore the other effects that your actions have beyond the meat industry itself. One person who goes vegan may increase the probability that others go vegan. If your friends see you enjoying a vegan lifestyle, they may be more likely to adopt it also. So even if you don't cross the threshold yourself, others that you influence may do so instead. Though, of course, that further point only really applies to publicly refraining from meat consumption. I suppose it won't really be relevant to the meat eater who pretends to be vegan and only eats meat in private. Okay, so just a quick advert here. I have a Patreon where I got a whole bunch of bonus videos. So if you want to access some bonus content, more of me, then you can go on Patreon and check that out. I also have a PayPal if you just want to throw me some cash. I've got some shirts available. Now, I advertised these last week. Well, not last week. It wasn't last week, was it? It was a bit longer ago than last week. But the previous video I did advertise these, and they actually sold pretty well. I mean, it seems there's people who are interested in having some Cane Bee shirts. So if you're still interested in Cane Bee shirts, the previous designs are still available, but they are limited. Every shirt is limited to a run of 10. So, they're going down. I have, however, got some new shirts for this video. As you can see here, we have the Meat Eaters Baker's Butchery shirt, and we have the vegan shirt with the Plague Doctor frolicking with some broccoli. So again, limited to runs of 10, and I guess we'll see how these do. But if you want to have some, if you want to have a carnivore shirt or maybe omnivore shirt or a vegan shirt, then there you go. They are now available. So with that said, let's get back to the video and let's look at some challenges to the threshold response. All right, so one obvious way to challenge the threshold response is to challenge essentially the kind of probability and the economics side of it. So Budolfsson, in his article, The Inefficiency Objection to Consequentialism, objects to the way that Norcross has worked out the probability calculation. So, the probability that my giving up chicken will result in fewer chickens being killed cannot be calculated merely by counting the number of people whose purchasing behaviour, if altered, would result in fewer chickens being killed. So, in other words, let's grant that it takes 10,000 people abstaining from chicken to make a difference, right? So we're just going to assume that, yes, 10,000 people abstaining will make a difference. If we have 10,000 fewer people abstaining, then, the market will respond, several thousand fewer chickens will be killed. What then is the probability that my abstaining will make a difference? Well, in the original threshold response, we said that was 1 in 10,000, but Budolfsson says, no, that's not how it works. It's not 1 in 10,000 because, well, for several reasons. For one thing, the probability that my abstaining will make a difference depends on the probability that those other 9,999 will abstain, and who knows what that probability is. Second, it requires that no other people start purchasing meat, that demand does not rise from other quarters. Right? If I abstain but somebody else starts purchasing, then nothing changes. Also, it's also going to assume that the lost income is not replaced by, for instance, subsidies, that other industries that utilize animal products do not end up increasing demand. The demand might come about by some other industry doing something different. Third, it requires that the food industry responds in the expected ways, for instance, by reducing production rather than by investing in marketing. We already mentioned when we were talking about, the original causal impotence objection that, when it comes to people who are rearing chickens, generally the way that it works is you just try to have the maximum number of chickens that your farm can support within your budget. So, you have a certain budget, you just try to get the most of them. And then there's a whole bunch of variation in terms of the, profit that you expect. So, there's always going to be other things you can do other than reducing production. And finally, it ignores other factors that influence production. So, they might raise more chickens because of a decrease in the price of chicken feed or an improvement in weather conditions. Now, none of this, of course, is to deny that there is a threshold point, right? None of this ultimately challenges the basic principle of the argument. Yes, there is a threshold point. Obviously, if enough people stopped buying chicken, then that would make a difference. So this doesn't deny that. The issue is just we can't calculate the probability of crossing that threshold point in the way that Norcross suggests. You can't just say, well, if 10,000 fewer people eat chicken, then, that will make a difference. So if I stop eating chicken, I have a 1 in 10,000 chance of making a difference. But often says, no, when you look at the empirical facts about the meat industry, the probability is going to be way lower than what Norcross concludes. And so obviously if you make that probability even lower, then this as the risk gets smaller and smaller and smaller, I suppose the less appealing the causal argument will seem. I suppose that's the idea. Now look, there's much more that could be said about this. As I said, the threshold response is a common response. There are plenty of people who defend it. So let's just grant that the response is correct with respect to the points about the economics and so on. There are further questions about whether it successfully rebuts the causal impotence challenge. One question is just, look, should we accept this principle that it is wrong to perform an action which carries a small risk of doing a very great harm? There are many actions that carry small risks of great harms. Consider the risk of killing a person every time you drive a car. Suppose I want to go to the cinema, but to get there requires a 30-minute drive. Going to the cinema, you might think, is a fairly trivial good. I could easily watch the film at home instead. Doing that would actually be much cheaper for me. And look, I have a perfectly adequate setup at home for film viewing. I'm going to the cinema to satisfy a whim, and I know that there is a small risk that in my drive there and back I'll cause a car crash and kill someone. Is it wrong to drive to the cinema? We don't ordinarily think so. Perhaps in this case the risk is too small or the harm is not great enough. I mean, maybe we'd feel differently if in driving the car we risked killing thousands of people. That's not normally the case when you drive a car. But still, it might be objected that the threshold response is assuming a far too demanding kind of precautionary principle. And there, I mean, more generally, there are philosophers who will object to acting on the basis of very small probabilities. Bradley Monton, in his article "How to Avoid Maximizing Expected Utility," argues that in decision making we should just discount small probabilities. So we should treat small probabilities as if they were impossible, treat them as if they had a probability of 0. So just ignore them when making decisions. Monton argues that this is the only plausible way to avoid paradoxes like the St. Petersburg paradox or the Pascal's mugging paradox. I have a video on the St. Petersburg paradox for more information on this. So I won't go into the details of Monton's argument here, but I just want to flag up that this is one option for the defender of the causal impotence objection. There are independent reasons to think that actually we just shouldn't even pay any attention to small probabilities. So if you get on board with that, then you're not going to find probably you won't find the threshold response very convincing. It's also worth noting, that this principle that it is wrong to do things that carry small risks of great harms has arguably quite demanding consequences just with respect to the food industry. So consider the following cases. You give your money to a local artist, knowing that the artist is a meat eater, and so the money that you're giving to the artist will be used to purchase meat. Is that acceptable? Or you visit a restaurant and you purchase a vegan meal. You know that you go to that restaurant knowing that the restaurant will use some of that money to order meat from a supplier, because it's not a completely vegan restaurant. They have vegan meals, but it's not a vegan restaurant. They buy meat, they purchase meat. So, in both cases, you are in some sense funding the meat industry. Your money is part of a causal chain that leads to meat being purchased. Now, it might be objected that, look, the difference in these cases is that, your behaviour does not create additional demand for meat, whereas purchasing meat directly does. But I'm not so sure about that. I mean, it seems like it does contribute to demand. If the artist had less money, they might not purchase meat, or at least they might purchase less meat. Certainly that's going to be true of many people. Similarly, if enough people simply stopped visiting that restaurant, it would close down. I mean, you could just only visit vegan restaurants, or if no vegan restaurants are available near you, just never go to a restaurant. You could easily do that, and in that case, you would help make it the case that these restaurants that purchase meat close down. So it looks like you are kind of contributing to demand indirectly in some way. Again, your money is part of this causal chain that leads to the purchase of meat. So this vegan argument may well rule out these kinds of behaviors, but that's very demanding, and perhaps that's more of a demanding consequence than many vegans would want to accept. The point here is that there are many ways in which economic activity places you in causal chains leading to meat production. And so the question is, why is it that, this particular part of the causal chain, where you go to a grocery store and purchase meat, is invested with such significance? So again, there's all of these kind of complex causal chains leading to meat production. The part where you go to a grocery store and purchase meat, that's, again, it's not like you're just yourself stabbing a bunch of animals to death. The connection that this part of the causal chain has is, there are many, many different steps, as we've seen. And so the question is, why is that being invested with such enormous significance relative to all of these other sorts of behaviors? And it's worth noting here that the challenge for standard veganism comes not just from the omnivore, but also from much stricter kinds of vegans. So to set this up, we can compare 3 people. So first of all, there's Ian. Ian eats a diet of whole foods. He's conscious of how his food is produced, so he tends to eat from environmentally friendly sources, and he generally avoids meat products. He's got a mostly plant-based diet, but he eats chicken once a week. And he agrees that, yeah, the meat industry is morally atrocious, but he just likes chicken, and chicken's a bit of a guilty pleasure for him. And, the rest of his behaviour, as I said, he's very conscious of where his food comes from and all of that. So, he just kind of shrugs and says, you know what, I'm going to give myself a weekly chicken, and I'm not going to feel too bad about it. Next up, we got Barbara. Barbara is a standard vegan. She just avoids consuming animal products, and that's it. That's as far as she thinks about it. And next up, we have Vicky. Vicky is a strict vegan, what we can call a strict vegan. She significantly restricts her diet. Industrialized agriculture kills large numbers of field animals, even in the production of crops, and it devastates habitats of other wild animals. So Vicky avoids this when practical. She really makes an effort to purchase, locally from producers she knows, or even grow her own food or whatever. She makes some effort to do this. Of course, it's not practical to avoid it entirely, but the point is she makes the effort. Vicky doesn't want to support animal agriculture in any way, so she's careful only to give money to vegan people and vegan institutions. Again, you can't, I can't control what happens to my money when it leaves my hands and when I give it to somebody else. So, it's not perfect, but she makes the effort. She avoids using motorized transport for anything other than necessities. She knows that vehicles always carry a risk of killing animals on the road, and so on. And now she's not stupid about this. She understands that, perfection is not available, but she makes these efforts. Now, it looks like Ian's contribution to animal suffering is going to be much less than the average person's. Actually, depending on the details of Ian's diet, his contribution to animal suffering might be less than the standard. It might be less than Barbara's. It depends on the empirical details with respect to, deaths of field animals and habitat destruction in the production of vegan food, right? But that empirical argument might go in Ian's favour there. But we can just assume, for the sake of argument, that it doesn't, right? In the relevant sense, Ian causes or supports more suffering than Barbara does. But it seems pretty clear that Vicky's contribution to animal suffering is less than Barbara's. So, the vegan tells us we ought to work to reduce animal suffering. We ought to stop treating animals as commodities. Problem is that there are many ways to do that, many ways to reduce animal suffering and to stop treating animals as commodities. And if we take the kind of vegan principles as strict rules, then someone like Vicky is going to say most vegans are moral failures by their own lights, right? At the very minimum, you should be aspiring to be like Vicky, not like Barbara. On the other hand, we could take the vegan principles as more like a kind of ideal that a person can achieve to a greater or lesser extent without necessarily being a moral failure. So that would allow us to say, look, it's fine, right? If you just, as long as you abstain from animal products like Barbara does, that's enough, right? You don't have to go all the way to being like Vicky. But if you say that, then it becomes unclear on what grounds we can condemn Ian, who consumes far fewer animal products than average. Barbara may be better than Ian, but it's not clear in what sense Ian has violated his moral obligations if we think of these principles as something more like ideals that we can kind of aim for. Of course, Ian supports animal agriculture in a way that Barbara doesn't, but Barbara supports animal agriculture in a way that Vicky doesn't. And so, the question is going to be, what's the justification for being like Barbara and not like Vicky? All right, so with all of this in mind, then maybe there's a slightly different way to think about the causal impotence objection. We might think, okay, look, purchasing meat, let's grant that purchasing meat does in some sense make a difference. The problem lies with the kind of difference it makes. When we consider the details of the meat industry, the complexity of social institutions and their interactions with that industry, it just doesn't seem like purchasing meat makes the right kind of difference, a kind of difference that would make it uniquely objectionable by vegan lights relative to many other questionable activities that the majority of vegans are willing to look past. And if you frame the causal impotence objection in that way, then the threshold response doesn't really help with that. At least not obviously so. So, that's the challenge to the causal argument and to the threshold response. All right, so let's turn now to some other responses to the causal impotence objection. The threshold response basically tries to show that we are not causally impotent, that we can, in the important sense, make a difference. These other responses will just grant causal impotence. They will say, yeah, we actually don't make a difference causally. Whether you choose to purchase meat or refrain from purchasing meat, it doesn't really make a difference. But these responses will claim there are other ways to bridge that gap between production and consumption. So the purchasing of meat is wrong, even though it doesn't make a causal difference. One idea here is the complicity account. This is suggested by Tristram Macpherson in the article Why I Am a Vegan and Why You Should Be One Too. So as Macpherson sees it, the basic problem with purchasing meat is that it is wrong to benefit from wrongdoing, regardless of whether this will cause more wrongdoing in the future. More precisely, Macpherson proposes this principle. It is typically wrong to aim to benefit by cooperating with the wrongful elements of others' plans. By cooperating with the wrongful elements of others' plans. By purchasing meat, you essentially become an accomplice to wrongdoing, and it's wrong to be an accomplice to wrongdoing. So one reason to take this kind of view seriously is that there are cases of consumption that seem bad for the same reason that purchasing meat is bad, but where there is no expectation that any kind of harm will occur. There's no expectation that you're going to be making a difference to the amount of harm. So the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy gives this rather hilarious case, the Chef in Shackles case. So Chef in Shackles is a restaurant where a chef is held against his will. Now this restaurant is a vanity project. It's not intended to make any money. The owners are independently wealthy, and they're going to continue to fund the restaurant, and they're going to continue to force the chef to prepare the same number of meals, regardless of how many people visit. Indeed, the restaurant charges nothing. Any money that's given to it is just thrown away, right? So the question is it wrong to eat at Chef in Shackles? Now, if you accept a kind of causal account of wrongdoing, then it seems like the answer is no, because if I visit Chef in Shackles, I make absolutely no difference to the well-being of the chef. I cause no further harm. But it seems like it would be wrong to visit Chef in Shackles. Now, the complicity account explains this. By patronizing the restaurant, by eating the food prepared by the enslaved chef, I have become complicit in the chef's enslavement. I aim to benefit myself by cooperating with the plans of the owners of Chef in Shackles. So the thought is, this is going to better fit a kind of complicity view. And I mean, this supports the kind of, this at least gives us an intuition that maybe complicity is really all that matters. And obviously when it comes to the meat industry, well, the problem is when you go to a grocery store and you buy some chicken, look, yeah, maybe you're not making any difference. But what you are doing is you are becoming complicit in the plans of the food producers. So we're agreeing that food production is morally wrong. It's a very serious wrong. It's wrong to cause this suffering, to kill all these animals. That's very wrong. And then what you're doing by purchasing the chicken is kind of giving it a thumbs up and being part of it. And you're eating the chicken, you're getting pleasure from it, you're complicit in this wrongful system. Now, one worry about this kind of view is that it's still going to fall afoul of the demandingness objection that we saw earlier. So suppose that Chef in Shackles expands the business, enslaves more chefs, starts selling the food that they prepare to other retailers. Well, it looks like that now becomes much more analogous to the current meat industry, and it seems like, well, if you're going to be, it looks like in that case you would be complicit by purchasing shackled food from those retailers. But arguably you would also be complicit by purchasing non-shackled food from those retailers. You should instead visit retailers who do not involve themselves with the Chef in Shackles industry. Arguably this doesn't really help us to explain, with respect to the Ian, Barbara and Vicky, it doesn't help explain why Barbara's behaviour is acceptable. It looks like this is going to push us more in the direction of someone like Vicky. So that may be an issue. A second concern about this is, suppose I think, as many people do, that there are many wrongful industries in contemporary society. I mean, living in modern industrial society, it might seem almost impossible to avoid complicity with some wrongful plans. Consider the many industries and practices that contribute to global warming, to other forms of environmental degradation, or the industries that are involved in exploitative labor practices, or the industries involved in unjust wars, or the industries associated with oppressive governments that violate human rights, or industries that kind of use their power and use their power and influence and wealth to just kind of do terrible things, right? There's all kinds of cases like this. I think I remember. I think I just saw today there was some news report about how the baby formula industry has been continuously lobbying very hard to prevent maternity leave. I'm not sure if this is actually true. I just saw this as like a kind of headline, and I don't know if this is true, but it seems like the sort of thing that could be true, right? And so the point is they're lobbying hard against what you might regard as being some sort of important social progressive goal, and why are they doing it? So that women are just forced to feed their kids baby formula rather than breast milk. Anyway, that kind of thing happens all the time, right? So, and that's relatively minor compared to some of the awful things that companies will do. But anyway, the point is, there's all of these terrible things that they do, and unless I become a hermit, I'm going to be complicit in various kinds of wrongdoing. So what that means is I have to kind of just pick my battles, as it were. And then the question is, well, why must I pick the vegan battle over various other battles that I might choose? In particular, I might, like Ian, pick the animal battle sometimes, most of the time, perhaps. I recognise the evil of animal agriculture. I reduce my intake of meat, but I don't eliminate it. Picking the animal battle doesn't necessarily mean always picking the animal battle. And again, the kind of person Ian is, he's very conscious of where his food comes from. He has other battles in mind, and he's not perfect at any of them. And so, sometimes, I don't know, sometimes he eats food that is, associated with some terrible environmental consequence, and sometimes, he eats chicken, and that's just the way it is. And maybe that's all we can expect of ethical consumption in general. Ethical consumption can't mean being perfectly ethical, and it can't mean completely divorcing yourself from complicity in the wrongful plans of some of these industries. Now, of course, this also raises a question about whether it's the case that when you do something like I seem to have missed a slide here. Never mind. So there was going to be a third slide where I would talk about. There's a further question here about whether it's the case that the kind of action that you take when you purchase meat from a supermarket actually counts as being complicit. I mean, especially so bearing in mind this point about how, look, modern society is extremely complex, and the sort of, supply chains are very complex, and all of these, wrongful things are occurring at some distance from all of us, and it's very hard to avoid being involved in some way, to have some kind of causal. It's very hard to avoid being part of these chains that lead to these, wrongful things. We might wonder whether that's really a case of complicity. I mean, certainly, so when you look at the initial case of Chef in Shackles, you're talking about just walking into a restaurant where at that restaurant there is a guy who's being enslaved, and the people who are enslaving him are right there with you, and you have people working there who are working with this enslaved person, bringing the food out to you. I mean, that's very direct. You are now directly, directly interacting with these people who are part of this. Even if the chef is just held in a basement or something and you can't see him, the point is you're very close to him. And on the other hand, when it comes to something like, okay, I walk into a store and just pick something up from a store, it's much more impersonal. And so, you might wonder if that really counts as complicity in the relevant sense. Okay then, so another kind of view is the attitude account, which holds that what's wrong with purchasing meat is that it exhibits problematic attitudes. So one way to think about this is in terms of symbolic value. Let's say that your grandfather gives you a copy of Descartes' Meditations. Well, that may have very great symbolic value for you, far greater than its monetary value, in virtue of the origin of this particular copy. If you were to just take this copy and throw it into a fire, that would, arguably kind of tell people something. It would evince a negative attitude towards your grandfather. If you take this thing that your grandfather gave you and then you just throw it into a fire, that would be a way of saying, like, I hate this man. So things can kind of have this symbolic value or indeed symbolic disvalue. So imagine that a person receives as a gift a ring that was initially stolen from a family that had been exterminated in some genocide. Now maybe the person who gives you the gift was not involved in the genocide at all, but the ring kind of came to them. There's some complex chain of ownership changes, but ultimately, like, this was a ring with a pretty dark history. You might say, it's morally wrong to take that gift. It's not going to make any difference to the number of people killed now. Obviously, the genocide was in the past. It's all done now. There's nothing we can do to change it. But this object has significant symbolic disvalue, and to accept this gift, to take this ring, to wear it, it would evince a kind of cruel, callous attitude to the victims of genocide, and that's morally wrong. It would indicate that you're just a kind of a scumbag. And so the same is true for meat consumption. This is a product of an evil process. Its origin involves a great deal of unjust suffering. To receive pleasure from this is to express a kind of cruel, callous attitude, an attitude that looks at animals as mere commodities to be used for our pleasure. And that's not the kind of person anyone should want to be. The attitude is in itself morally wrong. All right, now, the first question about this account is, why exactly does consuming meat exhibit any particular attitude to the production of meat? Obviously a person can purchase meat while also condemning the production of meat. That's psychologically possible. That's a psychologically possible state. It is possible for me to walk into a store, buy some meat, while at the same time thinking to myself, this is terrible. Where this comes from is terrible. The meat industry is terrible, and I might express that a lot. So it's possible for somebody to do that. So there must be some other way that the attitude is evinced beyond the, explicit verbal endorsement. But now this just seems to push us back to the question of the connection between production and consumption. So we ask, given that meat production is wrong, what is it about the consumption of meat that makes it evince a problematic attitude? And to answer that question, we have to give an account of the connection between production and consumption. So we can't then explain the connection between production and consumption by appealing to the fact that, it's got something to do with the attitude expressed by consuming meat. That would just be blatantly circular, because we want to know what it is about the consumption of meat that makes it evince this problematic attitude, given the facts about its production. A second concern is, it's not really clear that, even if eating meat does express some problematic attitude, it's not clear that this really explains the wrongness of meat consumption, at least not to the extent that I think most vegans would be happy with. Note that a particular difficulty here is that purchasing meat doesn't really need to be done in public. Most of the time when a person purchases meat, nobody needs to know about it beyond the workers at the grocery store. And actually, I suppose with, self-checkout, even the workers at the grocery store don't really need to know about it. I can consume meat largely in private. And why is it wrong to express morally questionable attitudes entirely in private? Let's say that I'm interested in, Nazi memorabilia. I'm not a Nazi, I'm just interested in the history. I have a Nazi flag on display in a room in my home, entirely private, where nobody else will see it, except perhaps my close friends who are well aware of my anti-Nazi views. I hate the Nazis. In fact, I just have an interest in their history and aesthetic. Well, look, it may well be true that in some sense displaying the Nazi flag expresses a positive attitude towards Nazis, but it doesn't really seem that wrong to do this. Not when you're just doing it in private, right? I mean, it might be worth distinguishing expressing an attitude from promoting an attitude. If I were to display the Nazi flag where it's in public and could be seen even by people who knew nothing of my intentions, if I were to just fly it outside my house, well, yeah, that might be saying something, and it might be argued that whether I intend to or not, what I'm doing there is promoting Nazism. The display of this symbol expresses a positive attitude to these views, and you can't, kind of cancel that expression by just personally disavowing those views. Most people who see the flag are not going to be aware of my disavowal. On the other hand, private behaviour doesn't promote attitudes in the same kind of way. And so, yeah, I mean, even if you say it's like, oh, there's some way in which it's wrong to have a Nazi flag in private in your house, you might just think, okay, well, maybe it is a bit wrong, but you know what? I'm just going to, look, nobody's perfect, and I just have like an interest in this and an interest in the whole aesthetics, and given that this is just in private, I'm going to keep on doing it. So in purchasing meat, at most we can say I've promoted the meat industry to whoever sees me buying it at the grocery store. Maybe not even that. If meat consumption is wrong for this reason, it doesn't seem to be all that wrong. If the worst I do is express a problematic attitude to a few people every now and then, well, maybe the pleasure I receive from eating meat is worth it. Nobody is a moral saint, right? We all have our vices, and so my point is just this. Yeah, again, I mean, if meat consumption is wrong for this reason, it doesn't seem to make it very wrong. And so this doesn't seem like a conclusion that the average vegan would be all that happy with, arguably. So I'll turn now to a suggestion from Andrew Chignell in his article, Can We Really Vote with Our Forks? Chignell's idea is, we can call it the collective obligation account. So his idea is, first of all, there are collective obligations. There are obligations that are held by whole groups rather than by individuals. Given the wrongness of meat production, the group of food purchasers have an obligation not to purchase the products of the animal agriculture industry. More generally, perhaps humanity has an obligation to treat animals well, not to impose enormous amounts of suffering and death just for the sake of human gustatory pleasure. So, there are collective obligations, and there is a collective obligation to treat animals well. And that means a collective obligation to stop purchasing meat. That's not an obligation any specific individual has. So at the moment, we're just saying the group as a whole has this collective obligation. But second, this collective obligation to stop purchasing meat leads to an individual obligation. Because Chignell says, when large numbers of people purchase meat anyway, so they're violating the collective obligation, this creates an individual obligation to, I quote, dissociate ourselves from those actions on the part of others in the group. So in general, when groups are in violation of their collective obligation, I as an individual need to show that I do not sanction the actions that violate the collective obligation. Chignell draws an analogy to race. He says, look, each race has a collective obligation not to oppress other races. Now, the obligation do not oppress other races, that can't be an individual obligation, because although a single individual can be racist and a single individual can, oppress particular people, a single individual doesn't typically have the power to systematically oppress an entire race. I mean, there's not actually anything I can do to systematically oppress a race. So rather, it's a collective obligation, right? The members of race X have a collective obligation not to oppress other races. Well, let's suppose then that race X begins to systematically enslave race Y. If I'm a member of race X, what is my individual obligation? Well, I can't stop it. I can't stop it from happening, and I can't remove myself from race X. I just have whatever race I have, and that's that. So I can't just leave it. But what I can do is dissociate myself from the actions of race X, and dissociation means strictly avoiding any racist actions. So if I express racist beliefs even in the privacy of my own home where nobody can ever hear me, that's enough to show that I haven't fully dissociated from the racist actions. And we can apply the same idea to purchasing meat. Humanity has a collective obligation to treat animals well. the meat industry is clearly a violation of this collective obligation. And when humans act in ways that violate their collective obligations, I ought to dissociate myself from those actions. And so I ought to dissociate myself from the meat industry. And that means, at the very least, I ought to refrain from purchasing meat. Now, there are some questions about the collective obligation account. I mean, one question is just, so as we've seen, the first step of this involves establishing a collective obligation. And then second, we have the inference from this collective obligation to an individual obligation. One issue is whether there's actually a coherent collective who could be said to have an obligation in the first place. So one question here is, does it really make sense to say that, humanity or people who purchase food or even meat eaters, is that a coherent collective? The type of collective that could be said to have obligations. People who eat meat have very little in common beyond their meat eating. And this kind of appeal to collective obligation might look especially suspicious when we consider the highly centralized top-down structure of the industrial food industry. So it seems pretty plausible to say that there's like a company, a food company, that acts as a collective entity and that has goals, interests, and obligations. Indeed, companies are coherent enough entities to be granted legal personhood in some context. But of course, if the collective obligation to stop animal cruelty is held by some company understood this way, then that won't entail anything about my obligations. I'm not part of the company anyway. But the point is, but anyway, right, if we look at, the food industry, we can see the food industry as kind of, the effects that it has and what happens in the world seems to be very tightly controlled by the actions of specific companies. And then you have, the consumers, but the consumers don't really seem to be acting as collectives. It's like, what is it that unites people who eat meat beyond the fact that they eat meat? Not really anything. So it's not obvious, even if we get on board with the idea of collective obligations, we might wonder whether it makes sense to attribute collective obligations to these collectives that are just totally kind of vague and messy and disparate and that don't really seem to have any specific goals or interests or anything like that. And in that case, that would challenge the idea that there's any collective obligation in the first place. A second question here concerns the step from collective obligation to individual obligation. Chignall's claim is that when a group of which you are a member violates their collective obligation, you have an individual obligation to dissociate yourself from their actions. But we can ask why exactly this is, and whether this is true in general. So let's go back to the race analogy. In the case of racism, maybe we can all, let's just agree that each race has a collective obligation not to oppress other races, and that second, you have an individual obligation to dissociate yourself from racism by not being racist. So you have an individual obligation not to be racist. Certainly, if the second point seems, I'm sure everyone would agree with that. And then with respect to the first point, if there are collective obligations that can be held by very disparate entities, then yeah, it seems pretty plausible that, races have collective obligations not to oppress other races. But now the question is it the case that the individual obligation here follows from the collective obligation? I think that this particular case is liable to be misleading because, very plausibly, the individual obligation not to be racist holds for other reasons that have nothing to do with the collective obligation. So, when a person expresses racist beliefs in private when nobody can hear them, well, minimally it seems like they hold racist beliefs, and arguably it's just wrong to hold racist beliefs. One reason why it might be wrong to hold racist beliefs is that it makes you much more likely to discriminate against members of that race when you finally go outside and interact with other people. So holding racist beliefs has negative consequences, which means if you identify any kind of racist patterns of thinking in yourself, you ought to try to change that. You ought to try to dislodge that, because any kind of racist pattern of thinking, once you go out into the world, is going to have negative consequences. And so you have an individual obligation not to be racist, but that obligation doesn't really have anything to do with the collective obligation of your race. You have an individual obligation to be racist for many other reasons. And the trouble is that, the same sort of point doesn't seem to be true of meat eating, at least if we buy the causal impotence objection. Eating meat doesn't make people more likely to kill animals. I mean, first of all, eating meat doesn't make you more likely to kill animals yourself. And presumably this is because the killing of an animal is so distant, you can look at the meat as mere meat rather than as a dead body. So, when you eat meat, it's not going to make you more likely to kill an animal. And if you accept the causal impotence objection, you also have to say it doesn't make other people more likely to kill animals. And again, the point of this collective obligation account is to give an alternative to the causal account. So we're just granting the causal impotence objection here. So, it still seems that the point, though, is that it seems to be an open question whether collective obligations generate individual obligations in the way that Chignall actually requires, right? Like, even if we think that there are collective obligations, it's still not really clear that this generates individual obligations. So the collective obligation that each race has not to oppress other races just might not mean anything for the individuals of that race. Sure, there's individual obligations not to be racist, but that obligation holds for other reasons. It's also worth noting that, as with most of the other responses we've considered, this collective obligation account is going to face the challenge of demanding this, because why stop at refraining from purchasing meat? Why would the appeal to collective obligation not be just as legitimate if made from Vicky as a criticism of the standard vegan? Even when it comes to racism, even minor acts of racism are often considered to be unacceptable. If we ought to dissociate ourselves from the meat industry, then plausibly that means dissociating ourselves from, for example, retailers who sell meat. At the very least, there's probably more we could be doing than merely refraining from eating meat. Okay then, let's look at a final option for the vegan. So finally, we might just deny that there is actually any requirement to bridge the gap between production and consumption. So I'm calling this the no account. We might just say we actually don't need to give an account of why it is that consuming meat is wrong. So basically the thought is no theory of consumer wrongdoing is necessary here. You don't need to give any theory of consumer wrongdoing. It's enough to appeal to a kind of Morean intuition. Once we have elaborated the facts about the meat industry, we have shown that it involves very serious wrongdoing. And that is in itself enough to show that you ought not to purchase meat. Now, obviously, this isn't a logically valid argument for the conclusion that you ought not to purchase meat, but it provides compelling reason for that conclusion all the same. The facts about meat production are in themselves compelling reason not to purchase it. We may not know exactly why it's wrong to purchase meat. We may not know exactly how to infer from the wrongness of meat production to the wrongness of meat consumption. But that doesn't matter as far as the case for veganism is concerned. We don't always need to know exactly why actions are wrong in order to know that they are wrong. So what you do when you give an account that bridges the gap between production and consumption is you show why it is wrong to purchase meat. But you don't need to do that. You don't need to know why something is wrong to know that it is wrong. Suppose, by analogy, that instead of killing and eating animals, an institution arises of killing and eating humans. And, we might again imagine a very racist society that rears humans of what they regard as the inferior race for food. Would it be acceptable to purchase human meat in this society? Well, obviously not. And yet, exactly the same production-consumption gap exists in this case. But, sure, the vegan is going to say, look, surely nobody would seriously defend the human meat consumer here. If you were to visit that society, and maybe you shouldn't even visit it, but if you were to visit it for some reason, and you were to then start purchasing human meat, we would just think that you're a complete scumbag. And our difficulty articulating why it is wrong does not and should not make us doubt that it is wrong. So, the basic idea of this approach is to rethink what it is that we're doing when we give an account of the link between production and consumption. We don't take this gap as a reason to doubt that purchasing meat is wrong. Instead, it just creates the question of why it's wrong. And as we've seen, there are multiple accounts on the table. Maybe none of these accounts are right. So maybe none of the views that I've expressed in this video about the link between production and consumption, maybe none of them are right. But that just means we haven't come up with the right account yet, and why should we expect to have done that? There's no guarantee that moral theorizing is easy, but there are many moral views and much of our behaviour that is prior to moral theorizing. There are certain things that we all recognise to be right, certain things we all recognise to be wrong, and these are the starting points for moral inquiry. These things that we all recognise as right or wrong, those things are the basic data that our moral theories are designed to account for. The wrongness of eating human meat in this thought experiment is one example of that. So what I can say is, there is some account that bridges the production-consumption gap. Some account must work, even if nobody yet knows what that account is. And it's not necessary for me to have that account in order to condemn those who purchase human meat. So this is the idea, right? You just deny having to give an account. Now, if the wrongness of purchasing meat is an obvious Maurean fact, why do the critics of veganism dispute it? I mean, so this is just one question here is, well, look, if it really is just so blatantly obvious that purchasing meat is wrong, and you don't even need, it's wrong, it's so obvious that you don't even need to give an account. Well, what's going on with all of these seemingly reasonably intelligent people who dispute that claim? Well, I mean, there's a lot of things we could say about this. It's not entirely clear that the people who dispute this claim are actually being honest. People are often very emotionally attached to eating meat, so perhaps what happens is something more like this. Verity eats meat, and she wants to continue eating meat. She likes eating meat. She likes the taste of it. She likes hanging out with other people who eat meat. There's some sort of cultural connection that she has to it, and so on. Now, Verity sees herself as a moral person, but she then encounters the facts about meat consumption. She sees this is, creating an almost incomprehensible amount of torture and suffering, and she sees that this is wrong. But Verity doesn't want to implicate herself in something that's so clearly wrong, right? Because again, she sees herself as a moral person. So she just searches for whatever defense will allow her to continue eating meat while still seeing herself as a good person. And maybe she lands on the causal impotence objection, that her actions don't make a difference anyway. But this is just an ad hoc rationalization, right? And if Verity were to be convinced that the causal impotence objection failed, she would just search for something else. Now, the key point is this. This is all just an ad hoc rationalization, and in fact, none of these ad hoc rationalizations are remotely convincing. But that doesn't really matter, because most of the time, you can just ignore the facts about the meat industry. So when you have a plate of meat in front of you, you don't have to think about the animals that suffered and died during its production. You can just look at it as food. You just look at it as stuff. Every now and then, you'll be reminded about the facts of the meat industry. Every now and then, you'll encounter vegans who argue against your behaviour. And it's in those contexts that you appeal to these, these ad hoc rationalizations, and you just kind of comfort yourself with these arguments. And again, if you put any pressure on these arguments, they're not convincing, right? Again, you are in denial of a very obvious Maurean fact, but it doesn't really matter. These arguments don't have to be convincing on reflection, because you don't have to really reflect on them. You just throw them out and you ignore the origin of your food, and then you move on. And that's it. And so, I suppose the thought here is, well, actually, people who recognize the facts about the production of meat do recognize the wrongness of eating meat. They don't really deny it. But, they kind of come up with these excuses, basically. Excuses for their behavior, and they know that they're excuses. They can see that they're just excuses, but that's all they need. So this is one kind of way to deny the need to bridge the gap. Maybe another way to deny the need to bridge the gap, at least in some sense, is to reframe what veganism is. So earlier I briefly suggested this thought of veganism as an ideal. Recall Ian, Barbara and Vicky. Standardly, veganism is presented as an obligation. But, here's a different way to think about it. Ian's behaviour is better than the behaviour of the average person's. Barbara's behaviour is better than Ian's, and Vicky's behaviour is better than Barbara's. And that's really all there is to it. In some sense, both Ian and Barbara ought to behave like Vicky. Or perhaps all three ought to behave even better. Even Vicky ought to behave better than she does. Nobody has totally clean hands. We should all try to do better. But, humans are flawed. And we all have limits, social and psychological. We all eventually just kind of hit limits to our willpower. Barbara does much better than average. From a practical point of view, it really doesn't make any sense to blame her when she, goes to a restaurant, buys some vegan food from a restaurant that also serves meat. After all, if we all behaved like Barbara, the world would be a much better place. If we all behaved like Barbara, the meat industry would go out of business entirely. But the same is true of Ian. Maybe to a slightly lesser extent. Ian behaves much better than average. And if we all behaved like Ian, the world would be a much better place. If we all ate an entirely plant-based diet, except for chicken once a week, the world would be a much better place. Far fewer animals will be killed. So, in practice, it makes very little sense to blame him for his weekly indulgence in chicken. So maybe all we can say is something like this. You should try to be better than average, and you should try to make improvements on yourself. If your diet includes meat every day, try to cut it down. Try to eat meat only twice a week. If you're like Ian and you eat, the only meat you eat is chicken once a week, maybe try to cut it down. Eat it only once a month. There's all kinds of improvements you can make to your behaviour. You don't need to make these improvements all at once. It would be impossible to make every imaginable improvement all at once. The key is simply to build better habits, revisit them every year or so. Veganism, as traditionally conceived, becomes a kind of idealized goal, and perhaps it's just one element of this broader idealized goal of ethical consumption. Condemning everybody who falls short of the goal is pointless. So we treat it more like a kind of ideal than an obligation. And maybe if we think about it in that way, it doesn't really become so important to worry about, what is the, can we bridge this gap between production and consumption? Is my behavior really making a difference, right, to what's happening? Is it making the right kind of difference? No, the point is we can just think about, well, how do we want the world to be? What would it be? What would the best sort of scenario be if everybody were to behave in a certain way? And then we just kind of make a few improvements to try to make ourselves a bit more like that. And maybe that's all we can do. But reframing it in that way maybe means we don't have to worry so much about bridging the gap. So anyway, that's it. That's the end of that video. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye, everybody.